Hi folks, Reverend Robin here, bringing you a message this morning using the gospel reading from Luke 24, verses 13 through 35. And this is the story of the road to Emmaus. We are in our time in the church that's known as the third Sunday after Easter. And this particular story, although Luke sets it in the time of Resurrection Day, so this story has happened immediately following, not 3 weeks later necessarily, but immediately following the events of the crucifixion and the empty tomb. And so these men are traveling down the road. They're on their way back home to Emmaus. They had been in Jerusalem during the time of the crucifixion and probably had been followers of Jesus. And as they're walking down this road, they're talking about the events of the day, and suddenly there's a stranger with them. Now, probably most of us have been in that situation where we're walking along a trail or something, and it seems like out of nowhere someone is suddenly there with us on the trail. That might not have been a seemingly unusual event for these people, but they don't know who this man is, and they certainly don't recognize him as Jesus. And so as they're walking along, they're having this conversation, and the man appears with them and says to them, "What are you talking about?" And so the men on the road, they start to tell Jesus the events of the time, and they may be a little bit surprised that he's not aware of what's just happened, particularly if he's on this road that has come out of Jerusalem. And so anyway, they tell him the story and their story of what had happened. And it is a story of pain and a story of disappointment. And in the story, they talk about what they had hoped for. But we had hoped this would be our Messiah. We had hoped he was here to save us. We had hoped that things would turn out differently than they did. And so they're in the midst of this grief, and they're walking along. And it's interesting to note that in this conversation, Jesus doesn't interrupt them with anything. He simply lets them tell their story. And this is an important point, I think, about this, because telling our stories are so powerful. We need to be able to tell our story to someone. This is where healing begins, when we can tell our story, tell what has gone on in our lives, particularly when we've had sadness and disappointment or bewilderment and even yearnings for things. If we can express those things, often telling them to another person, we find within that some kind of cathartic event that happens within us, and we often find some kind of healing. And so it's not a mistake that Jesus is with them, walking with them, listening to this story, and having this opportunity to allow this story to come out. And I thought of this part really, I sat with this part this week as I thought about the stories that are coming out of Nova Scotia and how cathartic it is for them to be able to tell the story. They cannot keep this bottled up, and in isolation, it's hard to find places to tell the story. And so we see that heart-wrenching video of the man whose wife was killed, and he's sitting in his vehicle being interviewed by the news, probably because it's the only place he feels he can let this go, what his true feelings are about his wife being shot on the side of the road, and him having just spoken with her minutes before, maybe even seconds before she's killed. What tragic circumstance that is, and that man needs a place to tell his story of pain. It's in reflecting that story back that he recognizes, that he is affirmed in his recognition of how deeply that sorrow runs. And those are the things, he cannot move to a healing place until he can release that piece of within himself. And so we think about that in this story of the men on the road. So Nova Scotians are on the road to Emmaus. They're talking about the events that have happened to them. COVID, of course, continues to be the road to Emmaus, that road filled with death and despair and illness, but in pieces and places. When we reflect back on it, there are places of triumph and people getting better, and healthcare workers working so hard, and all of the frontline workers who are in it along the way, and again, in this reflection of this time, my thoughts go to the people who are working in stores. One of my daughters continues to work. She works in one of the hardware stores that's deemed as an essential service, and she comes home every day with talking about how people have been rude about their orders that they're putting in, and things aren't right, and they're not getting it fast enough, and why can't they have it now, and those kinds of things. And it's disheartening. It's disheartening to have those times where you think people are just blaming you for circumstances beyond our control. And let's face it, folks, these places could just shut down and we wouldn't have the things that we have. We wouldn't be able to go and place our orders if we didn't have internet and all of these things. Anyway, I'm ranting, but I'm just trying to make that point, that we have these stories to tell and we need a place to tell them. But at the end of the walk, when they come to Emmaus, and they're now in the place that they've been traveling to, and these men turn to Jesus and they say, "Stay with us." Because there's been something happen. A relationship has formed, and even though they don't know who this person is, they want to know him better. They want to know him on a deeper level. And so they say to him, "Stay with us." And he does. And they go back to a home, presumably. And it's here that the men who had traveled with him recognize him as Jesus, because Jesus sits with them at table and he breaks the bread. And in this time of breaking the bread, they recognize that this little thing, this common thing, this meal shared together, is where it has meant the most to them, that this is Jesus revealed. And so we can think about, even in our aloneness, when we sit down to our meal and we give thanks for the food that we have, and we give thanks for the day that we've had, and we give thanks that we're on this side of things and not some of the other places we could be. These are the little things that bring us into this moment with Jesus and with God. And so we look for those places, the little things that are happening around us, the neighbor who leaves something on our doorstep, the friend who makes a phone call, the Zoom meeting where you finally see some faces of colleagues and friends. And it's in these places that we say, you're still with us. Thanks be to God. And so I leave you with that today, that we might have these glimmers of hope, that it may not be what we hoped for, but there's always something to look forward to. And so blessings on your week, folks. And until we meet again, I remind you, you have not been to church, you are the church. And may you feel God's love to the left of you and the right of you, in front of you and behind you, above you and below you, within and within everyone you meet along the road. Amen.